As you may know, we are now in the liturgical season that follows Epiphany. That means, of course, that we're in these weeks following Christmas, waiting for the season of Lent and preparing for Easter. Epiphany starts, you recall, with the wise teachers following a star to find Jesus, and all the passages that we read from the gospel lessons during these weeks following the marking of this journey are passages meant to illumine the fundamental ideology of who we are as a Christian community. Every week, it's like the light gets a little brighter. You've heard me say this before. It's like the little knob in my dining room. You punch it in and you turn it a little bit to the right to make the light brighter. Every time we read another story about Jesus, we turn the knob just a little bit, learning more about God through the life and witness of Jesus Christ. After all, you and I are disciples, like the first disciples, struggling to understand the gospel message, what relevance it has for our modern lives, how we live it out, and how it can change the world. This is our work in the season following Epiphany. Now, you don't need me to tell you that the Riverside Church is a unique place, a place where many of us call ourselves Christians, and we worship alongside many who are not so sure, and some who even call other traditions home. But in general, I think it's safe to assume that we're all aware that this is a Christian church, and a lot of us call ourselves Christians, except when we're watching Jerry Falwell Jr. on Fox News. At the very least, we understand that the ideology of Jesus is what binds us together in this place and guides us as we reach for God. And in that context, today we begin a 3-week worship series called Reaching for God. Over the next few weeks, we will hear the perspectives of friends who reach for the divine in ways that are a bit different than our Christian way. Next week, Imam Khalid Latif will be our preacher. And then the following week, Rabbi Angela Buckdahl on the 11th will be here in the pulpit. As an aside, Angela and I went to Israel together a few weeks ago, and she's a great preacher. You'll want to hear her. And today we tell a story about Jesus, the one we claim to follow. Weaving all of these stories together over the next few weeks, we'll be looking at some of the same questions that all humanity asks and has always been trying to answer. Who am I? What does my life mean? Who is God? Is there a God? And if so, how do we reach for God? These are fundamental questions to who we are, questions that you and I think about all the time, even if we don't know quite how to put the right words around them. And in the next few weeks, we will recognize that people from many different traditions are asking the same questions and reaching for God in ways that are different than our way. But you know, sometimes we human beings spend more time climbing all over each other, trying to get to God, comparing ourselves to one another, rather than looking for God here among us, calling us to lives of service that heal the world. Maybe, just maybe, in these next 3 weeks, the light will get a little brighter. And we'll know in ways we never knew before that all of us are longing for something bigger than ourselves, reaching toward God. It should go without saying that summarizing Christianity in 20 minutes is flatly impossible. There is no way to condense what it means to live and believe the way of Jesus without getting criticized for blasphemy of some sort. So I'm going to ask for a little bit of grace from you all today. We'll start, as we always do, with the assigned text for the week. You'll notice that today, guiding our exploration of the Christian approach to finding God, however, is this strange little passage from the first chapter of Mark's Gospel. It's this unbelievable story about Jesus that makes all of us progressive types a little uncomfortable. Jesus, busy in Capernaum one day, casting out demons. Now, casting out demons is not the go-to text that most of us would prefer to choose as a starting point for talking about Christian faith. These are moments in which the pastor is tempted to abandon the lectionary and choose instead a nice little passage about Jesus blessing the children or something. But I have to think there's a reason we're given this story today, and I started to wonder this week, what might it have to tell us about who Jesus is and who we are as we claim to be his followers? As we look at today's passage from Mark, it's important to note that every single gospel writer had a lens through which he wrote the story of Jesus. Each gospel writer begins his account telling a story that defines who Jesus was to him, like the thesis statement that your high school English teacher made you write at the beginning of every essay. In the Gospel of Matthew, for example, we meet the adult Jesus for the first time as a teacher. In Luke, Jesus is a healer, bringing good news to the poor and the oppressed. In John's Gospel, we find Jesus at a party, a wedding, turning water into wine and teaching us about abundance. And in Mark, where we land today, the first story that Mark tells about Jesus is Jesus doing battle with a demon, asserting authority and convincing folks who are watching that he did have a message from God after all. Strange as it sounds to our ears, maybe Mark is a good place to start as we think about what it means to live as followers of Jesus Christ. The Jesus we meet in Mark was someone who walked in this world with conviction, teaching a way of reaching for God that had heft and merit. He was someone worth paying attention to because he spoke with authority, the text says. Now, you know that you're going to be hearing stories about Israel for some time to come, and I cannot read this passage in Mark without thinking where I was just a few weeks ago. That morning, about 2 weeks ago, I woke up to a sunrise over the Sea of Galilee, got into a van, and took a ride around the lake to the ancient town of Capernaum. There we got out and walked into several churches that were built on ruins along the shores of the lake. It was the exact setting of today's gospel passage. Here's what it was like. Ancient Capernaum is a small town, like smaller than the inside of this nave. The synagogue was a structure just a few steps from the small houses built out of rocks where the fishers who worked on the lake lived. And Jesus, you could easily imagine him, this upstart in the community, an overachiever who spent part of his time in the local neighborhood hall talking about how he thought we could reach for God, and then going back to go fishing with his friends again. So why do we, modern people, claim to be followers of a rural fisherman who showed up in his local community town hall and cast out demons and spoke with authority about God? A friend and former boss of mine who is a Maronite nun, Sister Clarita, would always say, the uniqueness of Christianity is that we claim a God with skin on. A God who became human and who showed us how to reach for the divine right from the raw reality of our humanity. And there is something powerful about knowing that God has experienced everything that I have. Pain and joy and sorrow and laughter, everything that comes with being human. It's no wonder that 2,000 years later, we still claim to follow this one who stood up to evil and who reached for God, because we want to do the same thing. As I walked through the ancient town of Capernaum and saw what was likely the synagogue, the small community meeting place where Jesus cast out this demon, according to Mark, I started to wonder what Jesus would think if he walked today into the nave of the Riverside Church. Jesus was a small town boy who frankly would not know what to make of these stained glass windows and all of these beautiful stone carvings. Did Jesus ever envision a new religion based on his life? Walking around that small rural town, it was impossible not to wonder, because it was clear that all Jesus knew was a lake and a few small houses built out of stone and a local synagogue. So it was there in that setting that Jesus entered one day and began teaching with authority. People started listening to what he was saying and recognizing that it had some merit, some contribution to the answers they were seeking in their search for God. The text says there was a man in the synagogue who had an unclean spirit. He challenged Jesus and his teachings, and Mark tells us that Jesus cast out the unclean spirit, and everyone was amazed at his authority. In 1973, Frank and Ida Mae Hammond published a book called Pigs in the Parlor. You can still buy it on Amazon today. It's a practical guide to deliverance, casting out demons, written by a couple of Southern Baptists who are very concerned about our human ability to recognize and confront evil. The book has sold almost 2 million copies since its original publication, and there is a children's edition, a children's guide to casting out demons. Well, Pigs in the Parlor is a practical guide for anyone who wants to learn how to cast out demons. It's also a prescriptive way to talk about a reality that all of us encounter: bondage, sickness, suffering, trouble, the reality of being human in this world that is filled with pain and brokenness. Who among us doesn't want a life free of these things, filled with better health, better ability to live and thrive in the world, more experience of the peace of God both internally and in our communities? In fact, it was a custom of the first Christians to go through a ritual of deliverance upon conversion. You think we could start that in worship, Reverend Powell? It would be interesting. And do you know that every single organized expression of Christianity has guidelines or liturgy for dealing with demons? You can, of course, pick up your own copy of Pigs in the Parlor and learn all about the practicalities of deliverance. But before you do, it might be good to think about why Mark chose this story to begin a conversation about the way of Jesus. Perhaps it's because our own preoccupation with identifying evil is why we claim to be Christians. Without the particularity of God, with skin on, it's hard for us to recognize evil, and it's hard to know how to turn toward the good. Here in Mark's gospel, we meet Jesus fully human, yet somehow embodying the divine, and he comes face to face with evil, which happens to all of us. And with the divine authority that Jesus summons, we can see everything all of a sudden with a clarity we never imagined we could have. When we understand Jesus as God, we can appreciate how evil shrinks when it is exposed to the light. Now, we progressive Christians are generally much more comfortable with recognizing institutional evil rather than talking about our own personal demons. But the truth is that we all experience evil, and not just around us, very often within us. We need a God with skin on, a God who understands human weakness, because we also long so deeply to recognize even just one little spark of the divine in our own humanity. What would happen to our world if we recognize God in ourselves and we began to recognize God in each other? I'm still thinking about 2 weeks ago in Capernaum, walking along the banks of the Sea of Galilee, and I think Jesus would walk into this nave of the Riverside Church and wonder what on earth we thought we had created here. But I also feel convinced of this, that the life and witness of Jesus is a powerful way in which we individually and collectively reach toward God. That day in Capernaum and many days since, in this very place and in your life and in mine, Jesus has appeared as God with skin on, showing good and evil in sharp relief and helping you and me reach a little closer to God. Over the next few weeks, as I said, we'll be hearing about many different ways in which humanity reaches for the divine. And our work in these coming weeks is not a work of comparison. We're not studying an attempt to decide who has the best, most efficient access to God. Instead, we're looking for ways in which we can make sense of this human life we're living together. How we can discern the difference between good and evil, how we can speak up for good and justice and love in our world, and how we can reach for God a little further, a little closer, a little more than we were able to reach before. That's something to celebrate and cherish, a way in which God becomes real to us in this world where we are so often cut off from the divine. As Sister Clarita would always say, we Christians have in Jesus a God with skin on, a God who knows what it's like to be you and me. And this is a mystery we learn and continue to reclaim as we respect and honor others who reach for the divine in ways that are different. What would happen if we managed to embrace our own limited efforts, this witness of Jesus Christ, and join the limited efforts of others who are reaching for God? If we did that together, we could imagine a hopeful future for this world that is so broken. Take the witness of Jesus and reach this week a little further, a little closer to the God who loves you so very much. May it be so. Amen.